He comes down and walks up to our table, doesn't say a word, and reaches over and grabs our food and just starts eating it. And I look up and I'm like, God, this is how those movies start off where somebody gets kidnapped.
Hello, and welcome to Hired the Podcast. I'm Travis Miller. This conversation with the best and brightest minds in the world of work. Today, I have the incredible pleasure of talking with Trice Kabundi, the managing director of World 50 Group, leading a community of Fortune 500 executives. She is an expert at moderating conversations with world-class leaders and really empowering individuals to thrive. Trice, pleasure.
Happy to be here, Travis. Thank you.
You bet. Trice, I want to start off by plugging another show you were on. I was listening to your conversation earlier with Cameron Harold, the Second in Command podcast, and you guys really got me thinking. Starting out the conversation, you were talking about your incredible love of tiramisu and your passion for cooking and baking. And you said that you really like cooking and baking when you have the freedom to create. And It got me thinking a lot about what a wonderful metaphor that is for hiring. When you're hiring, if you are beholden to the recipe, I need to hire someone with this ingredient and this ingredient and this ingredient and this ingredient, and we cannot deviate in any way, it becomes a very rote process. And believe it or not, I found that the results to be significantly less formulaic. You never know what you're going to get if that's what you're doing. But if you have the creativity to hire the right people, I want a little bit of this and a little bit of that. No, I got a little bit of that, and I never really thought of that before. Then that's how you can find the people to truly, truly thrive in your organization. I just want to thank you for having that great conversation because it really sparked that thought in my mind.
I appreciate that. And actually, Travis, can I share something very quickly about Cameron? He sent me a knife as a gift that made its way to my office at the time. And my EA, there was no name on it. And so I get a call from my EA that says, somebody sent you a knife. And I don't know if this is a threat or what's going on, but it was just a very beautiful thing that had my name carved in there. And she's like, and they carved your name in this. Is this like a thing where it's like, we're coming to get you like the mafia? And I'm like, no, I think someone was sending me a gift. But yeah, that was a lovely conversation. And I think I came at it too from the point of I am not the world's greatest baker. And I am aiming to become a good baker. So actually my goal is by the end of the year to try to bake and frost a 3-tier like wedding cake, right? And figure something out and see if I can challenge myself. But I agree with what you said. And I go back to when I think about some of the best cooks in my life. And I actually think about someone like my mother where, you know, she's been paid to cook for people and she, you know, is renowned for what she's able to create. But what I love out of what you see her being able to do, which I equate with how you hire, is she has a good sense of who's going to be where, who's coming, what's needed to make it an incredible experience, sort of what she needs to put on the table. But I think when she gets to the actual process of cooking and bringing it together, there is a flexibility to understanding that she doesn't necessarily really have to stick through the recipe that she had in mind, but there's almost a beauty in customizing it for knowing what she has available, what's needed, the emotion that she's going for, and who's going to be in the room, and really curating to that. And so oftentimes when I think about the best hiring decisions I've made and the worst hiring decisions I've made, the best ones have been where in that moment when you're talking to someone, they weren't who you actually thought you needed. But there's that spark in that gut and you realize, actually, this person is filling a hole I didn't know we had, or they have the ability to transform this organization in a way that we didn't even conceptualize. And bringing them in is going to have such a significant impact. And I think there's a fear to deviate from that because especially if you've worked with a recruiter or whatnot, you kind of have this whole list of what you're looking for. All the stakeholders are in on it. You're usually consulting, or in my case, you know, at one point talking to the CEO and saying, this is what the CFO is going to look like. But I think it's that flexibility to realize there's so many things at play and you can actually get the best talent if you really allow yourself that flexibility to deviate.
I've noticed that a lot of hiring authorities, recruiters, internal talent acquisition, when they're setting up the search, we need to hire this person. A lot of times they'll start and say, what is the ideal profile? What does a perfect person look like? And I think they should come from the opposite end. I think they should say, what does the worst candidate look like? What is the worst possible background, the least level of experience in specific areas that somebody could possibly have in order to be barely adequate at the job?
Yeah.
Great. So we have that line. Let's talk to every single person we can at or above the line, because then your pool is so much bigger, and then you can focus on all of the things that you were just talking about, the soft skills, the creativity, the ability to fill holes that you didn't even know you needed. And I found that if you stick to the recipe, yes, I think they have more potential to be successful in their first 3 to 6 months.
Yep.
But after that, it's the people that have all of the things you didn't know you needed and all of the things that you can't identify on paper that allow them to be wildly successful for years and years to come. And maybe I'm off base. I mean, you're talking all of the time to leaders of incredibly successful organizations. How many of them have a philosophy similar to my thinking versus what could be called a more traditional, let's find a resume that best matches our job description?
Yeah, absolutely. You know what, and I'll even go as far back as the early beginnings of my career, Travis, and look at the best leaders I have known in every iteration of what I've done across my career. The best leaders I have known are the ones who have actually said, this is a great resume, but I want to know more about this person or show me other aspects of this person, right? And the resume itself, it's just a quick read, but it offers very little. And I think because of that, they've actually made stronger hiring decisions. And I think a key component is it's a little bit like dating and like websites, right? Dating websites. And that's how I think about it. The best of the person from the person who wants to be hired is going to show up. And I actually knew one person who was adamant about not doing reference checks because they're like, honestly, I'm going to hear the same thing when I talk to all these individuals and they're going to tell me the best components of this person. I'd rather actually see this person interact with my team, interact with people, and actually see what's reflected out of that when they're challenged or when they're working on a problem with me. And I think that's key because, again, the resume is going to show you the best of the person. Their LinkedIn is going to show you the best of the person. But I think it's really what happens in between those seams when you're having those conversations, when you're learning about how they think, what makes them tick, even how they, go through vision exercises or journeys. I think those things share more about the person. And the best leaders I've seen have actually taken a dive into that. Like, I remember one leader I worked with and, their question just around, I'm paying attention to what their mentors have told them or the last thing that was said to them that really shook them to the core about how they think about their development. And I think when you dive into that as an individual, that says a lot more than what a resume could. And I think it also allows you to identify someone who's got potential that you're otherwise missing out on, right? And I think about, again, some of the best hires I've made. You would not have necessarily gone for them based off of what was on paper. But I think through conversations, the questions they asked, the books that they read, how they spent their mornings, how they talked through visioning different ways that the organization could work with me, I was like, actually bringing you in is going to be a breath of fresh air that we need. And the talent side of things, you can develop into that and we can give you that runway. But we're not going to get this other part of your DNA with anybody else that we're looking at. And I think that's the piece that I've noticed with really strong leaders is key.
Can you think of the best person you hired that had the most unconventional background or experience for what you were hiring them for?
Absolutely. I think the best person I hired And actually, she was hired to be my EA, and she was also supporting our CEO. And it was during my time at Gray Matters Capital. And the organization was in such flux that we knew we were bringing in an EA. But I think what she was stretched to do within the role and within the organization, the board engagement, engaging with some of our investees that we were invested in, diving into some of the operational pieces, diving into some of the finance pieces. What's phenomenal is that she was able to stretch in such a way and help me really restructure our organization that today she's actually working within the cryptocurrency space. And she's the head of operations for a pretty large organization and is just rocking the hell out of that job. And so she was hired, and I think that's within the span of 3 years. So she was hired having come from very traditional consulting, organizations where she was a very traditional EA. And she stepped into an organization that required so much out of her. And I think what really enamored me with the ability to bring her in and see her flex was actually coming from her background and how she grew up and the things that she was able to do and what her interests were and how she laughed at certain aspects and commented on pieces of how we operated. And I said, you know what? I actually think she's going to be the person that's most adaptive versus some of these people we were getting who had served the CHRO of Coca-Cola and other people, where you would think, yeah, they can work in an organization this global. But instead, I think what she really brought was that ability to be nimble. And I think it paid off because you can even see where her career is today.
I'd imagine so. And that kind of dovetails into something you speak about a lot. And that's the integration of followership and leadership. And it sounds like she was able to come into a role that was probably a bit outside of her comfort zone and what she was used to, but she was able to take the leadership that you and your CEO were giving to her and catapult her career into new areas that she and you probably never thought possible 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. And here's what I actually say. I think the beauty actually, Travis, and I know typically we'll say, I never saw this person going in this direction. But I think the beauty of hiring people for more than what is in their profile is that you're actually hiring for the ability to be delightfully surprised, but also you're hiring with the understanding that they're going to be able to bring something to the organization that you can't predict today. And you've set yourself up to be able to see that happen. And I think that's the beauty of hiring in a very different way, is to say, actually, you can surprise me or you're going to do incredible things. And I know this is going to be a platform for you to do that. I can't tell you what it is, but also I can't limit my mind to think about what you'll be able to do because I'm bringing you in to do just that. So, I couldn't have predicted it would be the cryptocurrency space, but what I can actually say is I'm not at all surprised because in that moment when we met, I said, there's something absolutely special about this person, right? Same way when you're dating or you meet the one, you're like, the moment I met them, I knew I was going to have this incredible life with them and they were going to take me through this journey. And I can't tell you exactly what it is, but at the end of it, I'm not surprised, that we got lost in the middle of, India, and that was part of our love story, and I think that's the same way where I'm like, when you bring them on board with that purpose and you embolden them to have that, they don't even see it. So they're probably more surprised than the person who brought them on is how I tend to view it, right? I'm more surprised with how my career turned out. And when I talk to mentors and bosses I've had, the ones that were really lockstep in my development are like, yeah, we're not at all shocked. Not at all shocked that you were interviewing Killer Mike, days after he won the Grammy at an event and you were able to make it applicable to business leaders. Not at all surprised that you traveled, to Zambia and led an entire, country office and, we're spending time with these politicians day in and day out. And I never thought I'd ever do government affairs, but for me, it was a shock, but not for the ones who invested in me. And that's why it's not surprising, right? Does that make sense?
It does. I just have to go on a tangent. How is interviewing Killer Mike? I love Run the Jewels.
It is. It was an absolute honor, and I think he, it was so great that it was fresh a few days after he won the Grammy, and so one of the first questions I got to kick off with was, where does one put their Grammy? and or won the 2 Grammys, and it was incredible. And I think that's the beauty. And I'll take it back to World 50. That's the beauty of how we're able to think through large business challenges. Is we don't just talk to traditional business leaders. We bring in and we talk to these incredible leaders in other spaces and say, how are you thinking about innovation? How are you thinking about renewal? How are you thinking about reinventing yourself? How are you thinking about your ecosystem? And so, have someone like Killer Mike be able to just jump in there and share and get it and know and give his perspective. I think it was phenomenal, but also be able to be vulnerable about some of the things he talks about on his latest album.
Yeah, that is a very vulnerable album, talking about where he's come from and what the expectations were of him, where he could have ended up. I bet that was a fascinating conversation.
It was, and I felt like there was a small part of me that felt like I had a little bit of an Oprah moment with it, right? Because we talked about his mom, but I think at the end of the day, that vulnerability. I think there's a beauty in that, particularly within hip hop, and as you extend that to how business leaders think about vulnerability, right? I think that's one we know is increasingly a requirement that sort of this workforce as it evolves has from their leaders. And, I think people think about what their own brand of vulnerability looks like. And I think it's always good to have a reflection of that and how your history has shaped you and how you communicate that and your current, emotional viewpoint to the people who surround you and support you.
Mm-hmm. Back to your EA, in developing them, how conscious are you of what you're doing for them as a leader, with them as a follower? How much of it is conscious and strategic in how you do it, and how much of it is just Trice being Trice?
Yeah. I actually would say this. I think if it was just Trice being Trice, I would be so disappointed in myself as a leader. And there are moments I have been disappointed in myself because I feel like Trice being Trice is phoning it in. And so I think there's certain things you do as a leader where and we can get into this particular topic, later about just, how we're operating in a remote environment. But there's certain things you do as a leader where everyone who's learning from you or who looks up to you, they pick it up through osmosis, right? Mm-hmm. How you navigate certain things, how you communicate with a really sticky, tough stakeholder. And I think those are the things they passively learn from you. And that's very different, I think, from talking about someone's development. I think if you wear the hat of leader, particularly if you're a people leader, that's a big part of your job, right? You are you've been given, right, this sort of ability to really help develop and nourish what is the greatest asset an organization has. And if for all the people who report into you or maybe report into a direct report of yours, if you are not focused on whether or not there are plans for their development, whether or not there are plans for their success, or there are support systems in place to ensure that if they run into challenges, they're able to turn it around or feel supported. If you don't think about that in the morning, in the evening, if you don't think about that as part of your day-to-day duty and you're very intentional, then in my viewpoint, you might be hitting all of your numbers. Things might be great. The organization might think you're a phenomenal person to work with. But if your people aren't structurally developing, in my opinion, you failed as a leader, because that's the greatest thing you have to contribute as a leader. Because if you step away or you're no longer there and somebody else steps in and maybe they're not great at the numbers and then their people are suffering, you haven't actually really cultivated and nourished a key asset for the organization. And so that's probably one of the things that gets me the most is seeing people who phone it in and say, well, I've provided dollar resources, I've done these things, and now it's up to them to go and figure it out or be hungry. And I'm like, no, you've got to give them structure and the means to be able to grab those things and actually run with it. And if you don't know how your people are developing and what they're developing into, that is a problem.
I was reading a book recently by a guy named James Chitwood, and I'll find the title here shortly. And in his book, his conceit is that if a company is dependent on its leader for success, then that leader is doing a terrible job. A leader's job is to develop people, to implement systems, to put together an infrastructure in place so that when they're gone, the company continues to thrive and to continue to be successful. If a leader leaves and the company tanks, that leader did a very poor job.
Absolutely. And Travis, I'll even say if there even is, if that leader leaves and there's even a hint of that fear of how will we survive, and you have this entire talent pool, then you've done a very, very poor job. And I think that actually taps into succession, right? Because what that actually tells me is you didn't invest enough in succession. And so what you've actually done is you've invested in your ability to be a great leader, to look like a great leader, to take the company to success, but the ability to develop people internally to step in, even in an interim role, and keep things moving, you haven't actually made that investment. And again, I think that goes back to what are the requirements of a leader? Succession planning is one of the key things, right? And I think even as you hire folks at higher levels, you have to be thinking about succession all the time, right? Your own succession, their succession. And I think if you're not, that's very problematic. And I actually take it back to when, I was at Gray Matters Capital and my CEO hired me. We wound up having a conversation at one point because she was clearly, with the board thinking through succession, what happens if Erica Norwood leaves? And I was very clear, hey, I just want you to know I might be your COO, but I don't want to be CEO. So let's just be very clear that this is not your plan for succession. So make sure that you're actually structured and thinking about it elsewhere, because I know what it is that I want to do and I don't want the CEO seat. And that was a very clear conversation. And I applaud her because she actually had it and thought through, what does the future look like? And so I remember the founder even at one point asking if she were to leave and, join Congress, what would you do? Right. And so I think all of those pieces are essential because, that's a key part of talent development. Not just can you be a strong CFO, but, if I'm looking at you as CFO, have you developed somebody who can also step into your shoes if we lose you? And if they haven't and they're not capable of doing it, then that also is a key problem.
How does a CEO work to identify who is capable of filling their shoes, training them and educating them and bringing them along to be capable of filling their shoes, but also keeping them excited about the future while not filling their shoes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of those, to me, the answer that I look at is the excitement and the stretch of the roles that they are in. So where I think somebody is going to lose excitement is if you just have them waiting in the wings. And I'm sure you've seen this, right? Where you have somebody who's more than capable of being CEO. They want to be CEO. They've tapped out on what they can do within an organization. And then maybe the CEO, it's not time for them to depart or they're not ready to depart. And you actually have this person waiting in the wings, and I've seen it. And they're like, when is my time going to come? And that's when that sort of descent, right, begins to build within the organization. But I think if you're really looking at that runway and you're giving people opportunities and you're giving them stretch roles, it allows you to see where the extent of their skill set is. It allows them to continue to develop skills, take on more responsibility, and at the same time, continue to be excited about what next steps looks like for them, right? Because again, just because you have a succession plan doesn't necessarily mean that that's the one key person who's going to take over, right, as CEO or CFO or whatever that role might be. So there's so many different individuals who could potentially fill that slot. So I think it's the opportunity of making that role fresh for them and giving them brand new opportunities and stretch goals, right? And I think at least, for me, before we had that conversation around I don't want to be CEO, I was continuously stretched, and we'd actually had a pre-existing working relationship in the same company, but years prior. And what I could always say is the way that I advanced to new roles and never felt bored was I was always given an opportunity or given something I wasn't prepared for. And by not being prepared for it, I had the fear going into it and the support to be good at it, but also had a long runway to not be able to say, and usually these are high achievers, what happens when a high achiever gets bored? They start looking elsewhere. But I had that runway, and that's how I think about everybody else, is you have to give them that runway really, elevate them to a role when they're not prepared for it, because that's the best time to really assume it, unless your organization's in the middle of a crisis and you need someone to come in and immediately execute. But I think as long as you're doing that, it allows you to also identify how they latch on to those different aspects of the organization that you're bringing them into.
I would imagine you were also given a fair amount of maybe not permission, but an understanding and ability to fail.
I mean, 100%, and I think in some cases it was stated, and in some cases, it wasn't stated, it was implied. And, I think the beauty of that is great leaders have to also learn how to fail. Mm-hmm. And that is a conversation I think is really hard for us to have, because we will usually talk to someone who's on the other end of having failed at something to be like, okay, give us a play-by-play. Now we're in the post-fail zone. I don't think we talk enough to people who are in the middle of something really hard, or where they're failing, where they're not hitting numbers, where they're in a really tough spot, to understand that that is actually where you make your mettle as a leader, is in those particular areas. And honestly, Travis, I think if you look at our operating environment today, it's a really, really tough business environment. Whether you're a Fortune 500 or an SME, right? It's a really tough environment to operate as a business. And what you're seeing more and more of are, you have folks who are actively working through the challenges and are building muscles they never had to build during the era of plenty. Mm-hmm. Whether they're, young hires or executives who've been there for a while, they're having to build the tough time muscles. And these are actually the muscles that are going to allow for growth in the future. Or you have those who they've never failed, they've never gone through a tough business cycle, and now they're floundering and they're like, I don't know how to fail. I don't know how to deal with a tough business cycle. I've only ever succeeded. And that's where I think, and it's funny, I was actually talking to my dad this morning. We speak every morning when I go get my coffee, and we were just talking about failure, and the sense that is something we can sometimes be really bad at, is just, we'll tell people it's okay to fail, but we don't dive into how that failure is building the muscles that you actually need, almost to steal from Jim Collins to really make a good company great. You need people who know how to fail. Mm-hmm. The emotional weight of it, the physical weight of it, the how do you lead a team through it, because it's a very different way of operating as a leader, and not everyone has that.
I almost feel bad for people that have early success in their career. I've noticed that the people that we hire in our business, if we hire them in a very tough market, those people have a lot more potential for success years down the road, versus I've seen a lot of people fail who started in a very good market and had a lot of success very quickly. And then when things turned, they really, really struggled to get anywhere close to the level of success that they previously had.
Absolutely. And to that, what I would almost say too, Travis, is as a leader to challenge yourself and say, if I know that there's no such thing as an operating environment that won't have ebbs and flows within, right, the cycles of where we're operating, and you have someone who is high potential, they're clearly talented, they're operating in a time of plenty, if you also aren't putting them in a position to taste failure, and I almost sound just, a little deranged here, but almost, like taste defeat, if you're not putting them in a position to also face that and go through that, then I think there's a little bit of that failure of leadership, right? And a good bit of it is on them to also seek opportunities. But I think sometimes people need to face a bit of that pain within an organization and be confronted with opportunities that maybe will stretch them to that point where they could fail. And, I remember having leaders and mentors who would say, Trice, this is going to be sink or swim. You're most likely going to sink, and that is okay. But this is going to be sink or swim. Or, I remember one time I had this idea and I was talking to a boss and I said, okay, so here's the deal. I just need the funds to go up to New York. I'll meet with this guy at the UN. I promise you it'll be good for it. We'll get a partnership. And he was like, I can see failure coming a mile away on this one, but I'm going to let you do this to yourself and go for it. And so I think we need more of that, because actually you can create environments within the organization to give people the skill sets and the muscles that they need, even if there is not that sense of a pressure on the business that's naturally doing so.
Did you fail when you went up to New York?
Oh, 100%, Travis. And it was the worst trip possible. I woke up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, got to the airport, went up. I was supposed to return the same day and, had these meetings and it yielded nothing. And, it was a pipe dream, but it was a great sense of just knowing that you can put in all this effort, be so prepared for something and jump in, and it's just not going to give you what you actually wanted. And so I think that's the component. So I think about all of the failures that I've had, and the greatest, one of the greatest bits of advice that I got from my father, who's given me quite a good bit over the years, but um, he's very big on you journaling your journey as a leader. He's very big on that, and he'll say it often. Did you write that down? Did you capture that? Because you might think it's meaningless today, but it's so meaningful. And that's actually a practice that I've really, been implementing. And a key part of that actually was I started to write letters to myself when I was in businesses that were going through really, really tough times to say, I want to catalog this moment because it's going to mean something the next time I'm in a role. And I'm like a storm chaser. I tend to go after the things that are sticky and messy. And I actually found that reading those letters I wrote to myself at the really worst times within an organization were so, so helpful and allowed me to coach other people, because they're the things you forget when you're right in the midst of the storm.
That's something I could definitely be a lot better at. And I love that idea of writing letters to yourself. One of the more powerful exercises I did not too long ago, when I stepped into this role as president, was I wrote my retirement speech. And I know I got a young face, but I'm pretty far away from retirement.
Yeah.
But it really felt powerful. And you were telling me before we hit record that you recently saw a speaker who was talking about the 6-word legacy that he wrote for himself. And if at any given moment he was not conducting business in a way that would lead towards establishing that 6-word legacy, then that act was a failure. And I feel like that's a very powerful tool that not many people at all, and probably not a lot of leaders do that, is to actively write to themselves or write about themselves. And why do you think that is such a powerful tool in a person's self-development?
Absolutely. I'll start at the leader level. I think it's powerful because, and you know this quite well, you are probably in one of the loneliest spaces that you can be in an area where people might not tell you the truth as often as you like to hear it. People will hail your success and what you're able to do. You're constantly moving. You're always making key decisions that impact not just your life, but the lives of other people. You're constantly thinking about what's next and how you grow, not just yourself, but the organization. There's a financial component to it, right? Where you get more and more successful. And it's funny because it's trite but true. My younger self would have been like, "Oh, Trice, look at where you are today. You should be so happy with what you know." And I'm actually like, it's actually the opposite, right? It becomes more depressing because you put more of a weight on yourself to sustain whatever it is that you're doing. So essentially, you have created this whirlwind around you. And if your North Star continues to just be the success in the business, which can sway so often, you're actually going to lose sight of what actually matters. Mm-hmm. And I think the scary thing is you have a younger generation in the workforce that's also observing and watching and copying and following, whether they're in the home being raised by you or whether or not they're in the workplace, right, learning from you. And so I think the reason why, and this is, I love the 6-word legacy, but there's different versions of this exercise. I think the reason why that's so critical is because, again, it goes back to purpose. But if you can't draw a line in the sand to determine when you need to go, where you need to make a move, when enough is enough for you, when something violates what is intrinsically valuable to you, if you don't have a line in the sand, then I think you lose sense of self. And we've seen leaders who lose sense of self, and it's a very sad thing to see because, and I made this joke where at the lowest of the low that I've ever been, Travis, I started to count all the spaces that I was in to be able to replenish. And I was like, God, I'm really spending a lot of money and keeping a lot of ecosystems going, right? I've got a coach, I've got a therapist, and I'm seeing them the max amount of times I can see them. I'm in all the yoga practices. I'm doing all the different workouts. I've got the dietitian. What number supplement am I supposed to be on? Okay, don't forget, you've also got to meditate. And you're doing all these things. And I'm like, I'm actually not addressing what the key thing is, the elephant in the room, which is like, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing, and I am lost. And I am making decisions based on everything else except who I am. And I think that's the thing that's going to be there to center you, right? That's the thing where when you get so involved in your world as a leader, you actually lose track of even the important things like family and all those pieces. And what I love that I often, started to actually execute on is, and again, I come back to my dad. He has this thing about rivers and streams, and he says, life is actually a river, and you have these streams that lead into your river. And he'll always tell me, and he sounds like, almost like this really wise godfather. He's like, my daughter, work is but one stream, and it's true. And I think that's where that legacy comes into play for you to understand, are you investing in these other streams of your life that lead into your river, or are you over-invested in just one and you've lost all sense of self? And so for leaders, I think that's where it's particularly helpful. Same thing applies to people who maybe, are not in formal leadership roles or even are at the very beginning of their career. But, with them, I also think of, that Dave Chappelle story that he shared about his dad, where he said his dad told him when he first entered Hollywood, his dad told him, write down the total price that you're willing to pay. And if the cost of it becomes more than that, get out. And that's almost how I think about that, doing this exercise in early stage. To the extent of what you know about yourself and your values, write that down. And if that next promotion, the way the job is moving, the way the people in a company move, or you're offered a role when you go in and something doesn't sit right, understand that if it's more than what you're willing to pay for what your values are and your legacy, that's an opportunity to walk out, because there's going to be another job. There's going to be another opportunity. You're going to find something that's aligned for you.
Dad sounds like a pretty fascinating guy.
You said my dad does?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have fascinating parents, Travis, who, what I love about them is they don't care about the incredible. I mean, they care about the incredible things you get to do, but that's never usually the first question. The first question is like, are you happy? Was that good for you? Okay, good. Now tell us the actual story.
I don't have a good segue for this, but we've only got a couple minutes left here, and I wanted to dig into a little bit more the story you told me about some of the wild places that you can truly learn some incredible business lessons. You remember the story that I'm alluding to?
I do. I do know the story that you're alluding to. I don't think there's ever a good way to segue into a story like this, right? Unless you're like leading the witness. Tell me about that time at a hotel, right? So one of the beautiful things was, like I said, your career will take you to incredible places. And, I think if you take advantage of opportunities that come your way and just open yourself up to them, they will. So I was actually working at the African Union in Ethiopia, and it was a crazy time to be working in Ethiopia at the time in the African Union, because we were in the middle of the Arab Spring. So Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, that whole, space was just going through a lot of turmoil. There was this conflict in the Ivory Coast and in Cameroon and other places in Africa. And I showed up at the Peace and Security Council, which is in the middle of all of this. And I was asked to do pretty much, they learned I could write. And they're like, so you're just going to be writing speeches for all of our leaders. And that's what I did. I just, any speech that was given by, a leader within the Peace and Security Council, chances were I was in a room working with other speechwriters, or I was the one writing the speech. And so at that point, I was young, and I was tapped to go to this event where, a couple of ambassadors were going to be and represent the African Union. And I went, and I got into a debate with the former Ethiopian ambassador to the U.S. We got into a debate, and this journalist was there, and he captured pictures of it. And he wrote about it and pretty much was like, yeah, this debate happened. And he put it in a newspaper. So he comes up to me and says, are you okay with me putting it in a newspaper? I said, great. And he's like, hey, we should go have drinks sometime. So clearly I'm like, oh my God, this is what every young woman dreams of. A journalist in a foreign country, you become enamored with them. And so we start dating. And one day he's like, hey, I want to take you to this hotel. They have the best food. I'm like, great, let's go to that restaurant. We're driving in and there's all this security at the front. And I'm like, why is there so much security? It's not like one of the hotels that's frequented by ambassadors and diplomats. And he's like, no, it's fine. It's standard. So we go in and I'm seeing random people in fatigues. And I'm like, they look like military, but not the military I'm used to. This is strange. So we sit down, we order food, and, the waiter brings it out, lays the plate out. And at that point, Ethiopian food, you're eating with your hands. Essentially, we're eating with your hands. So we're talking. And all of a sudden, what I learned was the general, he comes down and walks up to our table, doesn't say a word, and reaches over and grabs our food and just starts eating it. And I look up and I'm like, God, this is how those movies start off where somebody gets kidnapped, because they usually start off in a very intimidating way of like taking something of yours. And then before you know it, it's like Taken Part 4 or something. And so at that point, the reporter looks up and they know each other and they shake hands. And it turns out that this is a member of one of the Eritrean rebel groups. And he's a general of this group. And they are having one of their biannual meetings or something at this hotel.
It's wild to think about.
And they all show up, right, in order to talk strategy and what's next and all these things. And me being me, I'm in this situation. I'm like, okay, well, clearly you know each other. And the guy's like, you know what? Do you want whiskey? Do you drink whiskey? And I'm like, I guess I do today. And so he asks for whiskey. They bring it out. He sits down and he's pouring all around. It's hot outside. And all his people are walking around, and we wound up talking for about an hour, hour and a half, with me just asking him questions and diving into legacy and how you think about succession planning, how you think about an organization that's reactive and growing and adaptive and has different cultural elements coming together. And, when an organization gets weary because they've been fighting something for so long, we wind up having this entire conversation, and he's giving me all his insights. And honestly, in that moment, I'm like, this is probably one of the best business conversations I've ever had. Like, if some leaders would come and spend some time with this Eritrean rebel group general, they would probably leave with a little better of like a Harvard executive, degree, because his ability to dive in, and I think what made it so strong was the heart of what they have to do is build a resilient organization that can manage in any operating environment and take whatever constrained resources they have and make it work and stretch. And now, as I think about that conversation, I'm like, is that not where most of our organizations and leaders find themselves today?
Mm-hmm. I wonder what he did to create his 6-word legacy.
That's a story for another day, Travis.
The question I can't get out of my mind is, I want to know the person in that organization that is in charge of event planning. Who booked the hotel and all of the rooms and got the right banquet room? Who's planning the menu? Do they have guest speakers? That's what I really want to know.
I agree with you, but it was a beautifully run event from what I could tell. There were break times, tea times, coffee times, everything just 5-star.
Trice, this has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate your time. Who are the types of people that should be reaching out to you, and what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Absolutely. Honestly, I will say this, Travis. I actually tell everyone I have conversations with everyone, because there are voices that I like to bring in rooms, and there are different perspectives that I think I just like to make sure that we're integrating into much of the work that we do. So best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. People are always DMing me. I always respond. I try not to leave a message go unanswered for too long. And, from storytellers to executives to founders, I'm hearing from them all. So always open to the conversation.
Trice Kabundi, appreciate it so much. This has been Hired the Podcast. Special thank you to Noah Cuff, our producer. Noah, appreciate you, bud. Trice, thank you so much. We'll talk to you all next time.
Thanks for having me, Travis.